before the streets of medieval Europe were illuminated by candles, before churches could fill their vast stone interiors with hundreds of flickering flames, and before wealthy nobles could afford to light their halls after sunset, someone had to spend endless hours working with hot wax, smoke, boiling water, animal fat, and fire. That person was the medieval wax chandler. Your day begins long before sunrise inside a cramped workshop where the air already smells of beeswax, smoke, and burned wick. There is no peaceful morning, no comfortable bed waiting for you, and certainly no clean workplace. Your hands are permanently coated with wax. Your clothes carry the smell of smoke, and the wooden walls around you have absorbed years of heat and candle fumes. Outside, the medieval town is slowly waking. Bakers are preparing their ovens, merchants are opening their stalls, blacksmiths are beginning to hammer metal, and carts are rattling across the muddy streets. But inside your workshop, the work has already begun. Candles must be made every day because churches need them for prayers. Monasteries need them for manuscripts and nighttime duties. Wealthy households want them for their halls. Merchants need them for their shops, and travelers need them when darkness turns the medieval streets into dangerous shadows. You are not a famous craftsman whose name will be remembered by historians. You are simply the person standing beside a boiling pot of wax, repeatedly dipping pieces of wick into liquid material until a candle slowly grows layer by layer. It sounds simple until you experience the reality. The wax must be heated carefully. Too cool, and it will not coat the wick properly. Too hot, and you risk burns, smoke, fire, or ruined material. The wick must remain straight. The thickness must be consistent. Every candle has to be checked. Beeswax is valuable, and wasting it means losing money. Nothing in the workshop can be treated casually. A single mistake can destroy hours of work. You begin by preparing the wicks, twisting fibers together and attaching them to wooden rods. Then the rods are lowered into warm wax, lifted out, and allowed to cool for a short time before being dipped again. You repeat the process. Dip, lift, cool, dip again. Slowly the candle becomes thicker. Your arms begin to ache from holding the rods. The heat becomes uncomfortable. Wax drips onto your hands and hardens against your skin. You scrape it away and continue. There is no shortcut. A candle cannot simply be created in a single movement. It must be built gradually, layer after layer, just like almost everything else in medieval life. And while you work, you know that the finished product will disappear almost immediately. A candle that takes hours to produce may be burned within a few hours by a wealthy household or a church. Your labor becomes light, and then it becomes nothing. You make something that exists only to vanish. Yet tomorrow there will be another order, another church service, another funeral, another wealthy family hosting guests after sunset, another monastery requiring candles for its altar. So tomorrow you will return to the same workshop, heat the same wax, prepare the same wicks, and begin again. This is the miserable life of the medieval wax chandler, a life surrounded by fire and darkness, valuable materials and exhausting repetition, where your hands create the light that allows medieval society to continue after the sun disappears. And tonight, as the streets outside become dark and the first candles begin glowing behind the windows of churches, homes, workshops, and castles, remember that every small flame has a story. Behind that flame is a worker who spent hours producing it, breathing smoke, enduring heat, burning his fingers, and repeating the same task until his body could no longer ignore the exhaustion. The medieval world may look magical when viewed through candlelight, but for the man who made that light, there was very little magic in it. There was only wax, fire, sweat, darkness, and another long day waiting to begin. Before sunrise, the medieval town is still wrapped in darkness, and the only light comes from a few weak flames burning behind wooden shutters. But inside your workshop, the day has already started. You wake on a rough bed in a small room connected to the workshop, surrounded by the smell of beeswax, smoke, damp wood, and yesterday's burned wicks. There is no comfortable separation between your home and your workplace because the workshop is where you spend almost every waking hour, and the same heat that keeps the wax soft also fills the room with an uncomfortable heaviness. You rise slowly because your arms and shoulders are already sore from yesterday's work. Wash your hands as best you can, and walk toward the main work area where the first task of the morning is waiting. Several large containers of beeswax sit beside the fire, and before anything else can be made, the wax must be cleaned and prepared. Beeswax is not simply taken from a hive and immediately turned into a perfect candle. It contains pieces of honeycomb, dirt, fragments of insects, plant material, and other impurities that must be removed before it can become valuable candle wax. You place pieces of raw wax into a heated container and begin melting them carefully, watching the surface as the material slowly becomes liquid. The smell changes as the wax warms, filling the workshop with a thick, sweet scent that mixes with smoke from the fire. You have learned to judge the temperature by experience because there are no precise instruments hanging beside the pot. Too much heat can ruin the wax, darken it, or create dangerous conditions around the open flame. Too little heat leaves the wax thick and difficult to work with. You constantly adjust the fire, adding pieces of wood and moving them away when necessary. This is one of the first lessons every wax chandler learns. Fire is both your greatest tool and your greatest threat. Without it, the wax remains solid and useless. With too much of it, your entire workshop could become a furnace. Once the wax is melted, you pour it through a cloth or other filtering material to remove larger impurities. The hot liquid runs slowly into another container, and you carefully avoid spilling it onto your hands. A burn from molten wax may seem like a small injury to someone outside the trade, but you know how much it can interfere with your work. A burned finger can make it difficult to twist wicks, hold rods, shape candles, or lift heavy containers. There is no modern medicine waiting nearby and no expectation that you will simply take several days away from work. If you are injured, you are expected to continue as soon as you can. The workshop cannot stop because one worker has been burned. After the wax is prepared, the next task is making the wicks. The wick is the heart of the candle, and if it is poorly made, the finished candle will burn badly no matter how beautiful the wax looks. You take fibers and twist them together, trying to create a consistent thickness. The process is repetitive and requires patience. Some wicks are made for small household candles, while others must be much thicker for large church candles that are expected to burn for long periods. The size of the wick determines how the candle behaves when lit. Too thin and the flame struggles. Too thick, and the candle may burn too quickly or produce excessive smoke. You prepare dozens of wicks and attach them to wooden rods, arranging them so that they can be dipped into the wax one after another. The rods are long enough to keep your hands away from the hot material, but not long enough to make the work comfortable. You stand beside the heated wax and begin the process that will occupy most of your day. The first wick is lowered into the liquid wax. You dip it slowly, making sure the coating reaches the correct height. Then you lift it out and wait. The wax cools quickly when exposed to the air, forming a thin layer around the wick. You dip it again. Another layer forms. Again, another layer. First, almost nothing seems to happen. The candle remains little more than a thread covered with a thin skin of wax. But after dozens of repetitions, the shape begins to grow. This is where the true misery of the job becomes obvious. You are performing the same movement hundreds of times. There is no excitement. There is no dramatic moment. There is only repetition. Your hands move automatically while your mind wanders. Dip, lift, wait, dip, lift, wait. You begin counting the repetitions because counting is easier than thinking about how many hours remain. The workshop grows warmer as the fire burns stronger. Sweat begins forming along your forehead. Wax sticks to your fingers and sleeves. Your back aches from standing in the same position. Yet the candles must continue growing. A wealthy customer has ordered a large batch for an upcoming religious ceremony, and the deadline is approaching. If the order is late, the customer may complain or take his business elsewhere. For a craftsman in a medieval town, reputation matters enormously. A wax chandler depends on customers returning again and again. Churches, monasteries, merchants, nobles, funeral organizers, and wealthy families may all require candles, and each one expects a different quality. Ordinary households may accept candles made from cheaper materials, while churches and wealthy patrons may demand clean beeswax candles that burn with a steadier flame and produce less unpleasant smoke. The difference matters because beeswax is expensive. Not every medieval candle is made from pure beeswax. Many poorer people cannot afford it and rely on cheaper animal fats that produce darker smoke and stronger odors. You know this because your workshop sometimes handles different materials for different customers. The richest clients want the cleanest candles, while poorer customers want something affordable enough to provide even a little light after sunset. This creates a strange hierarchy even in darkness. The quality of a person's light depends on the wealth of their household. A noble family can fill a hall with tall golden candles. A wealthy merchant can afford several candles for his shop. A poor laborer may have to depend on a tiny flame that barely reaches beyond the table. You are responsible for creating all of them. As the morning passes, the first batch begins to take shape. You inspect the candles carefully, checking whether the wax has formed evenly around the wick. Some are slightly crooked and must be corrected while the wax is still warm. Others have small holes or irregular surfaces. You reshape them by hand, smoothing the wax and ensuring that they will stand upright when placed into a holder. A candle that leans too far can be dangerous. In a world where most buildings are made from wood and where open flames are everywhere, a poorly made candle is more than an ugly product. It can become the beginning of a fire. You have heard stories of workshops, houses, and entire streets destroyed because a flame fell onto dry wood. Everyone in the town understands the danger, but people still need light. After sunset, darkness is not simply inconvenient. It can make travel dangerous, prevent work, interrupt reading and prayer, and leave people vulnerable to thieves and other dangers. Your candles, therefore, have a strange importance. They are small objects, but they allow people to extend their lives beyond daylight. That means the demand for your work never really disappears. Around midday, you finally step outside for a short break. The medieval street is crowded now. Merchants shout from stalls, carts struggle through muddy sections, animals move between pedestrians, and the smell of bread, horse manure, cooked meat, smoke, and wet earth fills the air. You stand near the workshop door and breathe the cooler air, grateful to escape the heat for a few minutes. Across the street, another craftsman is repairing shoes. Nearby, a blacksmith is hammering iron. Further down the street, A merchant is arguing with a customer over the price of cloth. Every person seems to have their own exhausting occupation. You realize that you're miserable. The next morning begins with a new order, and this time the work is more demanding because a nearby monastery has requested dozens of large beeswax candles for an important religious ceremony. The order is valuable, but it also means that you cannot afford mistakes. You arrive at the workshop while the sky is still gray, open the wooden shutters, and immediately begin preparing the fire. The room is cold at first, but that changes quickly once the flames begin burning beneath the wax pot. You add dry wood piece by piece and watch the wax slowly soften. Around you, the workshop begins to fill with the familiar smell of smoke and beeswax. You have become so accustomed to it that you barely notice anymore, although anyone entering from outside would immediately cough from the thick air. The first task is to inspect the wax delivered by the monastery's supplier. Some of it is clean and pale, while other pieces contain darker material and small fragments of honeycomb. You separate the better pieces from the lower quality wax because the monastery expects candles that burn cleanly during its services. The best beeswax is valuable, and wasting it could cost you more than a day's wages. You place the pieces into the melting container and wait as the heat transforms them into liquid. While the wax melts, you prepare the wicks. This part requires even more patience than usual because the monastery's candles must be thick enough to burn for long periods. You measure each wick against the others, trimming uneven ends and twisting loose fibers back together. Your fingers are already beginning to ache before the main work has even started. The master Chandler checks your preparation and reminds you that the candles must be uniform. He does not want some candles burning faster than others during the ceremony. If one candle burns down while the others remain tall, the imbalance will be obvious. You understand the pressure. A craftsman who disappoints a monastery can lose an important customer, and religious institutions are among the most consistent buyers of candles in the medieval world. They need them every day, not just during special occasions. Churches burn candles before altars, around sacred images, during prayers, funerals, processions, and ceremonies. Monasteries require them for evening prayers and for rooms where monks work after sunset. Your trade exists partly because the medieval religious world refuses to let darkness completely control the day. Once the wax reaches the right consistency, you begin dipping. The first coating is thin, almost invisible. You lift the wick and wait. The second coating is slightly thicker. You dip again. The candle grows. Again, again, again. Your body settles into the rhythm. The wooden rod moves downward, then upward, then pauses. Down, up, pause. Down, up, pause. After an hour, your shoulders are already tense. After several hours, the pain spreads through your back and neck. You change your grip, but it only helps for a few moments. There is no comfortable way to perform the same motion hundreds of times. The work is simple enough that a young apprentice can learn it quickly, but that simplicity is exactly what makes the occupation so exhausting. There is nothing to distract you from the repetition. As the candles become thicker, you begin hanging them on wooden supports so that they can cool evenly. The workshop is now filled with rows of pale candles. Some are short, some tall, and some nearly as long as your arm. The larger candles require more wax and more time, and they become increasingly heavy. You must be careful when moving them because a bent candle can crack or become misshapen. One damaged candle means starting again. The monastery has paid for quality, not excuses. Near midday, a monk arrives to inspect the order. He wears a simple dark robe and carries a small wooden box containing coins. He walks slowly through the workshop, looking at the candles without saying much. You can tell that he is judging everything. The color of the wax, the shape of the candles, the thickness, the quality of the wick. Finally, he picks up one of the finished candles and examines it closely. He asks whether all of them will look the same. The Master Chandler assures him that they will. The monk nods and leaves a portion of the payment before returning to the monastery. You watch him disappear into the street and think about the strange journey these candles will soon take. They will leave your workshop and enter a world of stone walls, incense, chanting, bells, and religious ceremony. Your hands will never be seen during those ceremonies. Nobody will think about the worker who stood beside a fire for hours to make the candle. They will simply see the flame. After the monk leaves, the work continues. The afternoon is hotter than the morning, and the workshop becomes almost unbearable. You open the shutters wider, but the air outside is barely cooler. Sunlight enters through the opening and reveals countless particles of dust floating above the work area. The fire crackles continuously. Wax drips onto the wooden floor and hardens into small pale pieces. You step carefully around them. The Master Chandler warns everyone to keep the floor clean because loose wax can make the workshop dangerous. You scrape the hardened pieces into a container for later melting. Even the leftovers are valuable. Nothing disappears completely. Every scrap can be reheated and used again. You begin to understand why the workshop always seems covered in old wax. The material is constantly being melted, shaped, cooled, broken, collected, and melted again. The entire room feels like a cycle that never ends. One of the apprentices makes a mistake while carrying a container and drops it near the fire. The sound makes everyone turn. Hot wax spills across the floor, spreading quickly. The apprentice immediately steps backward, terrified of being burned. The Master Chandler rushes forward and moves the container away from the flames. If the spilled wax reaches the fire, the situation could become disastrous. Everyone works quickly to contain it. The wax is still hot, but they manage to collect most of it before it becomes useless. The apprentice is scolded severely, not simply because he damaged the workshop, but because he could have started a fire. Medieval towns are vulnerable to flames in ways that are difficult to imagine. Wooden houses stand close together. Roofs are often covered with thatch, and fire can move from building to building with terrifying speed. A workshop filled with wax, wood, cloth, and open flames is particularly dangerous. You have seen burned buildings before. You remember entire sections of streets reduced to blackened ruins. That memory never leaves you. Every time you light the fire, you know what could happen if you lose control. The master checks the workshop carefully and finally allows the work to continue. You return to the candles. Your hands are trembling slightly from fatigue, but you keep dipping. The monastery's order must be completed. Outside, the town grows louder as afternoon traders move through the streets. You hear carts, animals, merchants, and distant church bells. Inside, all you hear is the fire and the soft sound of wax dripping back into the container. The contrast is strange. The medieval town is full of movement, but your work remains almost completely stationary. You spend hours standing in one place while the world outside changes around you. By late afternoon, the first large candles are finished. They are arranged carefully on wooden racks. Their surfaces are smooth and pale, and the wicks run perfectly through their centers. You feel a small sense of satisfaction. Despite the exhaustion, there is something impressive about seeing raw wax transformed into something so useful. But the satisfaction does not last long. There are still dozens more to make. You begin another batch. The same process starts again. Heat the wax, prepare the wicks, dip, lift, cool, dip again. Your arms ache so badly that you begin using more of your body weight to control the rod. The days begin to blur together as the monastery order becomes only one part of your growing workload. And before you have even finished delivering the last of those candles, another customer arrives at the workshop asking for a completely different kind of order. This time it is a wealthy merchant preparing for a large gathering at his home, and he wants dozens of candles that are tall, clean, and perfectly shaped so they can stand in expensive holders throughout his dining hall. He is willing to pay well, but he is also demanding. He examines every candle as if it were a piece of fine craftsmanship rather than something that will eventually melt away. He turns one between his fingers, checks its surface, looks at the wick, and asks whether the candles will burn without producing too much smoke. You know the answer depends on many things. The quality of the wax matters. The wick matters. The temperature during production matters. Even the way the candle is stored before use can affect its condition. Yet the merchant does not want to hear about difficulties. He wants perfect candles delivered on time. After he leaves, you begin preparing the next batch, and the workshop once again becomes a place of heat, smoke, and endless repetition. You have now spent so many hours around melted wax that your hands have begun to change. Small burns have left marks on your fingers. The skin around your nails is dry and cracked. Wax has worked its way into the folds of your hands and sometimes remains there even after washing. Your clothes are stiff in places where hot wax has fallen and hardened. The smell of smoke follows you everywhere. Even when you walk through the town after work, you can tell that people recognize your trade before you tell them what you do. The scent of beeswax and smoke clings to you. It is almost impossible to escape. In the morning, you prepare the wax while one of the apprentices sorts the raw material. The wax arrives in uneven blocks, some pale and clean, others darker and full of impurities. The apprentice asks why some pieces are worth more than others. You explain that beeswax is not all the same. Wax from different hives can vary in color and quality, and the way it has been collected and processed affects the finished candle. The cleanest wax produces a better product, but it is also more expensive. This is why the workshop must carefully separate and filter everything. Nothing is simple when every kilogram of material has a value attached to it. The apprentice watches as you melt the wax slowly, and you realize that he is learning the same lessons you once learned. You remember your own first days in the trade, when you did not understand how easily a candle could be ruined. You remember dipping a wick too quickly and creating an uneven layer. You remember holding a candle incorrectly and bending it while the wax was still soft. You remember the first burn you received and the pain that lasted for hours. Now you are the person teaching someone else how not to make those mistakes. The cycle continues. Medieval craftsmen pass their knowledge from one generation to another because there are few written instructions and no modern machines to perform the work. Your hands are your tools, and your experience is your measuring device. By midday, the merchant's order has become the main focus of the workshop. The candles must be tall and straight, and because they are intended for a wealthy household, the quality must be noticeably better than ordinary market candles. You prepare each wick carefully and begin building the candles layer by layer. The process is slow, but the merchant has requested a large quantity. You quickly realize that the order will require many hours of work. The first candles are dipped repeatedly until they become thick enough to stand securely. Then you inspect them for imperfections. A small crack appears on one. You set it aside. Another is slightly crooked. You carefully warm the wax and straighten it. A third has an uneven surface. You smooth it with your hands. Every imperfection costs time. The master chandler reminds you that wealthy customers are paying for precision, not merely for light. You understand the difference. A poor family may accept a candle that burns unevenly because they cannot afford anything better. A wealthy household can demand perfection because they have enough money to reject anything that does not meet their expectations. In the medieval world, even something as simple as a candle reflects social status. You have seen the difference between the homes of rich and poor customers. In a noble hall, dozens of candles may burn at once, reflecting from polished metal, painted walls, and expensive fabrics. The room can remain bright even after sunset. In a poor cottage, a single small candle may be placed in the center of a table, and everyone gathers close to it because there is no reason to waste the light. You make both kinds of candles, but the wealthiest customers are often the most demanding. As the afternoon progresses, the heat becomes unbearable. You open the shutters, but the workshop is still filled with warmth from the melting wax and fire. Sweat runs down your back. The apprentice wipes his forehead and looks toward the door, but there is no opportunity for a long break. The order must be completed. You continue dipping. Your movements become automatic. The rod goes down into the wax, comes back up, pauses, and repeats. You can almost perform the process with your eyes closed. The candles grow slowly. The workshop fills with them. Hundreds of pale shapes hang from wooden supports. The sight is impressive, but you know how much labor each one represents. A single candle may take dozens or even hundreds of dips depending on its size. A large ceremonial candle can require an enormous amount of wax and time. When you look at the finished rows, you do not see beauty. You see hours. You see every repetition required to create them. You see the aching shoulders and burning fingers hidden behind the smooth surface. During a short break, you step outside and notice a procession moving through the street. Several people are carrying candles toward a nearby church. The flames flicker in the wind, and the procession moves slowly through the narrow medieval streets. You recognize the type of candle they are carrying. They were probably made by a chandler like you, perhaps even by your workshop. You watch the procession disappear through the church doors and think about how your work has become part of religious life. Candles are not simply practical objects. They symbolize purity, prayer, remembrance, devotion, and the presence of sacred light. People may attach deep meaning to them, yet the person who produces them is still standing in a hot workshop scraping wax from his hands. There is something strange about creating an object that others consider sacred while experiencing it as exhausting labor. You return to the workshop and continue working. As evening approaches, the merchant returns to inspect the progress. He is pleased with the quantity but notices several candles that are slightly darker than the others. He asks why. You explain that the wax came from a different batch. He is not interested in the explanation. He wants the color to be consistent. You tell him that you can separate the darker candles and replace them with cleaner ones, but that will require additional time. He agrees, but only after reminding you that the candles are needed soon. After he leaves, the master chandler sighs and tells you to begin again. You feel frustrated, but you know there is little you can do. The customer has money. You need the payment. The workshop depends on orders. So you melt additional wax and begin producing replacements. This is another reality of your trade. Your time does not always belong to you. A customer can reject work that took hours to produce, and you may have no choice but to start over. The night grows darker outside, but the workshop remains bright with firelight. You continue working until your vision begins to blur from fatigue. Your hands move slowly. You accidentally drip hot wax onto your wrist and immediately pull away. The burn is painful, but you have experienced. The order for the wealthy merchant is finally delivered. But before you have time to enjoy even a few quiet hours, another customer arrives at the workshop with a request that will make the next several days even more exhausting. A local church needs a large supply of candles for funerals, evening prayers, and several upcoming ceremonies. And because the church has been a regular customer for years, the master Chandler immediately accepts the order. You know what this means before he even gives you the details. More wax must be melted. More wicks must be twisted. More candles must be dipped. And more hours must be spent standing beside the fire. The church does not simply want a few ordinary candles. It needs candles of different sizes, from small pieces that can be carried by worshippers to enormous ceremonial candles that require large amounts of beeswax and take hours to produce. You begin by sorting the wax again, separating the cleanest material for the largest candles. The heavier pieces are difficult to move, and you carry them from the storage area to the workshop one by one, feeling the weight in your arms before the real work has even begun. The fire is lit before sunrise, and soon the melting pot begins to warm. The workshop fills with smoke, and you open the shutters despite the cold outside. You have learned that keeping the air moving is necessary because too much smoke makes your eyes burn and your head ache. Yet opening the shutters also allows the winter air to enter, creating a strange contrast in the workshop where your face feels cold while your hands are sweating beside the fire. You work between these two extremes for most of the morning. The first candles are large and heavy. You prepare thick wicks and attach them securely to wooden rods. The dipping process is slower because every layer requires more wax. A small candle can be dipped and cooled quickly, but a large ceremonial candle demands patience. You lower the wick into the wax, lift it carefully, and allow the coating to settle. Then you repeat the process. Each dip adds only a thin layer, but eventually the candle becomes enormous. Your shoulders begin to ache almost immediately because the rods are heavier than those used for smaller candles. You change hands frequently, but the pain simply moves from one arm to the other. The master Chandler reminds you not to rush. A large candle that is built too quickly can develop cracks or uneven sections. If that happens, the entire piece may have to be reheated and corrected. You slow down even though every part of you wants to work faster. The hours pass slowly. Outside, the town becomes busy, but you barely notice. You hear bells from the church that placed the order. You hear carts passing through the street. You hear merchants calling to customers. You hear children running through the muddy lanes. Inside the workshop, your world remains the same. Fire, wax, wick, rod, repeat. You begin to understand why medieval craftsmen often describe their work in terms of seasons rather than days. A day inside the workshop feels endless, but months pass quickly because each day looks almost identical. One morning becomes another. One order becomes another. One candle becomes another. The only obvious measure of time is the changing weather outside the shutters. As winter deepens, the cold makes the workshop more difficult in one way and easier in another. The fire provides warmth, but the wax cools faster when exposed to the cold air, meaning you must work carefully to maintain an even coating. Your fingers become stiff whenever you move away from the fire, then too hot when you return. You constantly adjust your position. During one particularly cold morning, you notice frost on the wooden frame of the workshop door. The apprentice complains about the cold, and you tell him to stay near the fire, But you know there is no truly comfortable place in the workshop. Near the fire, the heat is intense. Farther away, the cold enters through every gap in the walls. You have to work in the middle where neither is comfortable. By midday, the first large candles are nearly finished. You lift one carefully from the rack and inspect it. It is taller than your forearm and thick enough to require both hands. The surface is smooth and pale. You cannot help admiring it for a moment. There is a strange satisfaction in creating something so solid from a material that was once nothing more than fragments of wax. But you also know what will happen to it. It will be taken to the church, placed near an altar or carried during a ceremony, lit and slowly consumed by flame. The candle will disappear. The church will need another one, and you will make it. This thought is not depressing at first, but after years of work it becomes difficult to ignore. Your entire occupation is based on creating objects that are designed to destroy themselves. A blacksmith makes a tool that may last for years. A carpenter makes a table that may remain in a household for generations. A stone mason builds walls that may survive long after he dies. You make something that is intentionally burned away. Your best work is ultimately measured by how well it disappears. If the candle burns evenly, produces a steady flame, and leaves little waste, then you have succeeded. The better you are, the faster your creation vanishes. In the afternoon, the church sends a young messenger to check the progress. He looks around the workshop with curiosity because he has probably never seen so many candles being made at once. He asks how long the largest candles will burn. You explain that it depends on their size and the conditions in which they are used. He seems surprised that something so simple can require so much work. You almost laugh. To him, the candle is an object. To you, it is hours of labor. He leaves after receiving an answer, and you return to work. The workshop grows hotter as the afternoon fire is increased. The large candles need more wax, which means the melting pot must remain active for longer. You carefully monitor the temperature because the larger volume of wax takes longer to melt evenly. A layer begins forming on the surface, and you break it apart with a wooden tool. The smell of warm beeswax becomes stronger. It fills your clothes and hair. You wipe your face and realize that your skin is covered with a thin layer of dust and wax. You look at your hands. They are no longer the hands you had when you entered the trade. They are rough, scarred, cracked, and stained. Small burns cover the fingers. There are cuts from fibers and tools. Wax sits beneath your nails. The work has physically changed you. You wonder whether anyone outside the workshop would recognize how much labor can be hidden inside such a small object. A candle looks simple because all the difficult work is invisible once it is finished. Nobody sees the raw wax being cleaned. Nobody sees the wick being prepared. Nobody sees the hundreds of dips. Nobody sees the mistakes that had to be corrected. Nobody sees the burns. They see a candle standing upright in a holder. Then they light it. That is all. As evening approaches, the church bells ring again, and you know the workday is nearing its end. But the order is not finished. You continue. The apprentice is becoming tired, and you notice him leaning against the workbench. You tell him to sit for a moment. He looks embarrassed, but you know the feeling. Exhaustion is part of the trade. You remember your own first year, when you believed that eventually your body would become stronger and the work would become easier. Instead, your body simply became accustomed to being tired. There is a difference. You can work while exhausted, but you are not less exhausted. You simply learn how to ignore it. The final large candle is finally completed late at night. You place it carefully on the rack beside the others. For several moments, nobody speaks. The workshop is filled with rows of candles, their pale surfaces reflecting the flames around them. It almost looks beautiful enough to forget the misery required to create it. But then you notice your hands again. You flex your fingers. The church order changes the rhythm of the workshop for several days. But as soon as the last candles are delivered, a new problem arrives. The weather has turned colder, and the supply of clean beeswax has become smaller than expected. Several merchants who normally bring wax from the countryside have arrived late because roads are muddy and difficult to travel, and the master Chandler begins worrying about how long the workshop can continue producing candles at its usual pace. You notice the difference immediately. The storage area that normally contains stacks of raw wax is beginning to look strangely empty. A few weeks earlier, the shelves were crowded with blocks of yellow and brown beeswax, but now there are only scattered pieces waiting to be melted. Every piece is counted. Every scrap is saved. Even the hardened wax that has fallen onto the floor is collected and placed into a container for later use. The shortage means that your work becomes more careful because there is less material available for mistakes. A candle that would normally be discarded because of a small imperfection must now be repaired. Wax that would once have been considered too dirty must be filtered again and reused. Nothing can simply be thrown away. The master Chandler spends much of the morning speaking with merchants, trying to determine when the next supply will arrive. You listen from the workshop while continuing to prepare wicks. The conversations outside the door are tense. Everyone knows that when a material becomes scarce, its price rises. If beeswax becomes too expensive, poorer customers will no longer be able to afford proper candles, and even wealthy customers may begin demanding lower prices. The workshop survives by balancing the cost of materials against the price of finished candles. You had never thought much about this before. To you, wax was simply something you worked with. Now you understand that the entire trade depends on a chain of people you will never meet. Bees must produce the wax. Beekeepers must collect it. Merchants must transport it. Sellers must bring it into town. Your workshop must process it. Customers must buy it. If one part of that chain fails, your work is affected. The medieval world is full of such fragile connections. A bad harvest, a damaged road, a failed shipment, a war, or a harsh winter can change the price of ordinary materials almost overnight. By midday, the master decides that the workshop must begin producing smaller candles until more wax arrives. You are disappointed because the smaller candles require just as much attention, but at least they use less material. The apprentices begin preparing thin wicks, while you melt the remaining clean wax. The smaller candles are easier to make physically, but the quantity is much greater. Instead of producing a few large candles, you must make hundreds of small ones. You line up the wicks and begin dipping them. The motion is faster now. Down. Cool. Down. Cool. The candles begin growing one after another. Soon the workshop is filled with rows of them. Your arms still hurt, but the lighter rods make the work slightly easier. Your mind begins wandering again. You think about the people who will eventually buy these candles. Some will be used by merchants who need light in their shops after sunset. Others will be taken into homes. Some will be carried by travelers. Others will be used during religious ceremonies. Some will burn beside the beds of sick people. Others will burn beside the dead. The same object can be present at almost every important moment of medieval life. Birth, prayer, illness, celebration, mourning, and death all require light. You have become part of all of those moments without ever witnessing most of them. Your candles enter places you will never see. One might burn in a noble hall. Another might burn inside a poor cottage. Another might stand beside an altar. Another might be carried through a dark street during a funeral procession. You make them all in the same small workshop. In the afternoon, a poor woman arrives carrying a small pouch of coins. She asks for the cheapest candles you can provide. You show her several options. She counts her coins carefully and asks whether she can buy only 2. The master agrees. She chooses 2 small candles and leaves. You watch her disappear into the crowd. The moment is brief, but it stays in your mind. You know that the candles you make are not equally valuable to everyone. For a wealthy merchant, a candle is an ordinary purchase. For a poor family, even a few candles may represent a meaningful expense. Light itself has a price. The woman may use those candles carefully, extinguishing them whenever they are not absolutely necessary so that they last as long as possible. You think about how different that is from the wealthy households where candles are allowed to burn for hours simply because nobody needs to worry about the cost. You return to the workshop and continue working. The afternoon becomes darker as clouds gather outside. Rain begins tapping against the wooden shutters. The sound is calming for a few minutes, but then you remember what rain means for the supply merchants. The roads will become worse. Carts will move more slowly. Deliveries may be delayed even longer. The master closes one of the shutters to prevent the rain from entering, and the workshop becomes darker. Only the fire and a few finished candles provide light. You realize that you are now working by the very products you are creating. A candle burns beside your workbench while you make more candles around it. The flame dances across the wax, making the walls appear to move. For a moment, the workshop almost feels peaceful. Then the smoke reaches your eyes and the illusion disappears. You cough and turn away from the fire. The air is thick. You open the shutter again despite the rain. The cold enters immediately. Your hands become numb, but at least you can breathe more easily. You continue working between the cold air and the heat of the fire. By late afternoon, your fingers are so stiff that twisting the wicks becomes difficult. The apprentice offers to take over some of the work. You let him. He sits at the bench and begins twisting fibers while you return to the wax. Watching him work reminds you of your own beginning. He is still young enough to believe that the trade might become easier with experience. You know better. Experience will make him faster, more precise, and more valuable to the workshop, but it will not remove the heat or the smoke. It will not stop his shoulders from hurting. It will not prevent burns. It will simply teach him how to continue despite them. As the evening approaches, the rain becomes heavier. The town outside grows quiet earlier than usual. Merchants close their stalls. People hurry home. Carts disappear from the streets. Inside the workshop, however, the fire continues burning. The candles must be finished before the wax cools completely. You continue dipping the smaller candles until your movements become almost mechanical. You stop thinking about each candle individually. They are simply numbers now. 20, 30, 40, 50. Another row, another rack, another batch. Eventually the master tells you to stop. There is no point continuing tonight because the remaining wax needs to be conserved. You place the tools aside and begin cleaning the workshop. Hardened wax is scraped from the workbench and floor. Small pieces are collected. Cloths used to filter the wax are folded and stored. Containers are wiped clean. The fire is reduced but not completely extinguished because some of the wax must remain warm overnight. You inspect the flames carefully before leaving. A A single spark could destroy everything. The workshop contains too much material that can burn. Once you are satisfied, you step outside. The rain has almost stopped, but the streets are covered in mud. You walk carefully through the darkness. A few candles glow through windows, and you notice the shipment of beeswax finally arrives several days later. But instead of making your life easier, it brings another problem because the material is more expensive than expected. The merchant explains that the journey from the countryside was difficult. The roads were damaged by rain. Several carts became stuck in mud, and the price of transportation has increased. The master Chandler has little choice but to accept the shipment because the workshop cannot survive without wax. You watch as the blocks are unloaded and stacked inside the storage area, and for the first time in days, the shelves look full again. Yet you know that every block represents money that must eventually be recovered through the sale of candles. The master immediately begins calculating how much each candle must cost, and you hear him discussing different prices for churches, merchants, wealthy households, and poorer customers. The numbers mean little to you at first, but you slowly understand that every candle you produce has to carry part of the cost of the wax, the transport, the firewood, the workshop, and the labor. A candle may look like a simple object, but behind it is an entire chain of expenses. You return to the workbench and begin sorting the new wax. Some pieces are beautifully clean and pale, while others contain darker material that will require additional filtering. The best pieces are reserved for the most demanding customers. You know that the merchant who supplied the wax expects payment quickly, so the workshop must increase production. For the next several days, the work becomes almost unbearable. The fire remains burning from early morning until late at night, and the workshop becomes a place where time seems to stop. You wake before sunrise, enter the workshop, and begin working before the town is fully awake. You leave only after darkness has already settled over the streets. The same pattern repeats again and again. You begin to lose track of the days. Monday looks like Tuesday. Tuesday looks like Wednesday. The only difference is the number of finished candles hanging from the racks. One morning, the master announces that a large order has arrived from a noble household preparing for a celebration. The family wants enough candles to illuminate an entire hall during an evening feast. The order is enormous, and the payment could be very useful for the workshop, but the deadline is extremely short. You immediately understand that the next few days will be some of the longest you have ever experienced. The noble family does not simply want ordinary candles. They want tall, bright, clean burning candles that will look impressive throughout the hall. Their servants have given detailed instructions about the size and shape. The candles must match each other perfectly. You prepare the wicks and begin working with the cleanest beeswax available. The first candle takes a long time because every layer must be smooth. The second is faster. By the 10th, your hands have found the rhythm. By the 50th, your body is exhausted. Yet there are still hundreds to make. The workshop fills with rows of candles, and you begin working almost without speaking. Everyone understands that conversation wastes energy. The apprentices focus on preparing wicks and carrying wax. You and the other experienced workers handle the larger candles. The master moves between the workstations, checking the temperature and inspecting the finished pieces. Every few hours, he reminds everyone to be careful because rushing can destroy an entire batch. You try to listen, but your body is becoming heavy. Your shoulders ache. Your wrists hurt. Your fingers are covered in small burns. The heat makes your clothes damp with sweat, but the cold air entering through the shutters makes you shiver whenever you step away from the fire. You begin to wonder how the noble family can possibly understand how much effort is required to produce enough light for one evening. For them, the feast will last a few hours. The candles may burn throughout dinner, music, conversation, and celebration. For you, the same light represents days of labor. You imagine the hall where they will be used. Stone walls, wooden tables, expensive fabrics, silver cups, decorated dishes, musicians, servants, and perhaps dozens of candles burning at once. The room will look magnificent. Guests will admire the warm golden glow. Nobody will think about the workshop where those flames were created. That thought does not make you angry anymore. It simply makes you tired. You continue working. One evening, while preparing another batch, you notice that one of the larger candles has developed a deep crack along its side. You pick it up carefully and inspect it. The master sees the damage and immediately tells you to separate it. The candle cannot be delivered like this. You ask whether it can be repaired, and he says it can, but it will require reheating and rebuilding part of the surface. You know that means more time. You place the candle near the fire and slowly warm the damaged section. The wax softens. You smooth the crack with a heated tool and carefully add another layer. The repair works, but you realize that the process has taken nearly an hour. One small imperfection has cost an entire hour of labor. This is the kind of problem customers never see. They only see the finished product. They do not see how many times a candle may be corrected before it reaches them. Late that night, a messenger from the noble household arrives to check the progress. He enters the workshop and immediately looks uncomfortable because of the heat and smell. You can tell that he is not used to this kind of environment. He asks whether the order will be ready on time. The master assures him that it will. The messenger looks at the rows of candles and seems impressed by the quantity. He asks how many people are working on the order. The master answers. The messenger nods and leaves. You watch him step back into the cold night and wonder what it must be like to work in a place where you can simply walk away from the heat. You cannot do that. The workshop is your livelihood. If you stop, the candles stop. If the candles stop, the money stops. There is always another reason to continue. The following morning, your body hurts before you even begin. Your hands are stiff, and your back feels as though it has been carrying stones all night. You stretch your fingers and enter the workshop. The fire is already burning. The wax is already melting. You take your place without complaint. This is perhaps the hardest part of the trade. The work does not care how you feel. Whether you are sick, tired, injured, or simply exhausted, the candle still needs to be made. You begin dipping again. The repetitive motion almost becomes hypnotic. The rod enters the wax, rises slowly, and cools. Another layer, another candle, another hour. Outside, the weather changes. Rain begins falling again. You hear it against the roof while you work. The workshop becomes darker, and the fire becomes the only strong source of light. Someone lights a small candle beside the workbench so that you can see the details of the wax. You notice the irony immediately. You are making candles by candlelight. The tiny flame reflects across dozens of unfinished candles, making the workshop appear almost magical. But you know that magic is simply labor seen from a distance. Up close, it is heat, smoke, and aching muscles. As the rain continues, the workshop becomes humid and uncomfortable. The wax behaves differently in the damp air, and you have to adjust the process. The apprentice complains that some candles are taking longer to cool. You tell him to slow down and allow them more time. A rushed candle is a ruined candle. He listens. You remember hearing the same advice when you were young. The trade is built on patience, even though the customers constantly demand speed. That contradiction follows you every day. You must work quickly enough to meet deadlines, but slowly enough to maintain quality. You must save material without making cheap candles. You must produce enough to earn money without exhausting yourself completely. Yet no one has written. The celebration at the noble household ends before you have even recovered from the work, and the next morning the workshop is quiet for only a few minutes before another customer arrives. This time it is not a wealthy merchant or a noble servant, but a man from a nearby funeral guild, and the order he brings is different from anything you have made that week. Several people in the town have died, and the guild needs candles for funerals, processions, and prayers. You immediately understand that this will not be a simple order. Funeral candles are often needed quickly, sometimes with almost no warning, because death does not wait for a convenient schedule. The man gives the master Chandler a list of different sizes and quantities, and the master reads it carefully before accepting the work. You begin preparing the wax while thinking about the strange nature of your trade. The same hands that make candles for celebrations also make candles for death. Yesterday your candles illuminated a noble feast filled with music and laughter, and now you are preparing candles that will stand beside coffins and graves. The wax does not care what kind of moment it will illuminate. It is simply melted, shaped, cooled, and burned. You begin with the wicks, preparing them according to the sizes requested. The larger funeral candles require thicker wicks, while smaller ones must be thin enough to produce a modest flame. You twist the fibers carefully and attach them to rods. The workshop is still cold from the night, so the fire burns strongly. The wax begins melting, and the familiar smell fills the room. You have spent so long around it that you barely notice anymore, but the apprentice coughs as smoke rises toward the ceiling. You open the shutters, allowing a stream of cold air into the workshop. The temperature drops immediately, but the smoke begins moving outside. You continue working. The first candles are small, intended to be carried by mourners during the funeral procession. They do not require as much wax as the larger ceremonial candles, but the order contains many of them. You place the first wick into the melted wax, lift it carefully, and wait for the coating to cool. Then you dip it again. The process continues. You watch the thin candle slowly become thicker. While you work, the funeral guild's messenger remains nearby, waiting to make sure the order is completed quickly. He keeps looking toward the door as if expecting more news. You ask whether another funeral is planned. He says that several families are waiting. Disease has been spreading through parts of the town, and more deaths are expected. You do not ask for details. You have learned that medieval towns are full of illnesses that can turn a normal week into a period of mourning. Your candles will be needed regardless of how many names appear on the list. The thought makes the workshop feel darker even though the fire is burning brightly. By midday, the first batch is ready. You arrange the candles in rows, checking each one for cracks and uneven surfaces. The funeral guild's messenger examines them and approves the quality. He asks whether the larger candles can be finished by the next morning. The master says yes. You know that means another long night. The messenger leaves with the first batch, carrying the candles carefully through the narrow streets. You watch him disappear and return to the fire. The larger candles require much more wax and patience. You prepare the first one and begin building it layer by layer. Each dip adds a little more thickness. You rotate the rod slightly as the wax cools so the candle remains even. The movement becomes familiar. Your arms work automatically, but your mind is elsewhere. You think about the people who will carry these candles. Some will be family members. Some will be friends. Some may barely know the dead person. They will walk through the streets carrying small flames, and the candles will burn while bells ring above them. Your work will be part of their grief, even though they will never know you. The thought is strange. Your candles enter people's most private moments without you ever meeting them. A candle may burn beside a newborn child during a baptism. Then another may burn beside an old man during his final hours. You provide the same object for completely different moments of life. The afternoon passes slowly. The workshop becomes hot again, and the fire reflects against the walls. You wipe sweat from your face and continue. One of the apprentices asks why people use candles at funerals. The master answers that the flame represents light in darkness, hope, prayer, and remembrance. You listen quietly. You have heard these explanations many times, but from inside the workshop they sound different. To you, the candle is also a product. It is wax, wick, labor, and payment. Yet you cannot deny that it becomes something more once it leaves your hands. People attach meaning to it. Perhaps that is why the trade survives despite its exhausting nature. You are not simply selling wax. You are selling light, and people use that light to give meaning to moments they cannot control. As evening approaches, you continue making the large candles. Your shoulders begin hurting again. The same pain that followed you through the noble household order has returned. You shift your position and stretch your fingers. The master tells you that you can take a short break, but you know the deadline is approaching. You decide to continue. The fire burns lower for a moment and you add more wood. A sudden burst of flame rises beneath the wax pot, making everyone step backward. The master immediately controls the fire. Nobody speaks for several seconds. You look at the flames and remember how dangerous the workshop truly is. One mistake could turn the place into an inferno. The wooden walls, racks, cloths, tools, and wax would all feed the fire. You have seen enough fires in the town to know what happens when flames escape control. Entire homes can disappear. Streets can burn. People can lose everything in a single night. Yet your occupation requires you to work beside an open fire every day. There is no way around it. The same flame that creates your product can destroy your livelihood. After the danger passes, you return to the workbench. The final large candles take shape slowly. Their surfaces become smooth and pale. By midnight, several are finished, but there are still more to make. The apprentice is almost asleep while standing. You tell him to rest, but he insists on continuing. The master finally orders everyone to stop for a short time. You sit on the floor near the wall, leaning against the wooden boards. The heat from the fire feels pleasant after hours of work, and for a few minutes you close your eyes. You can hear the distant bells of the church. Somewhere outside, a funeral procession may already be preparing. The sound of the bells reminds you that the candles you are making will soon leave the workshop and enter a world of mourning. When you return to work, the night feels quieter. The town outside is almost completely dark. Only a few windows show candlelight. You continue dipping the final wicks. Down. Cool. Down. Cool. Your body knows the movement even when your mind is exhausted. Eventually, the final candle is completed. You place it carefully on the rack. The master counts the order and nods. It is finished. You clean the workshop slowly, collecting wax scraps from the floor and returning them to the storage container. Nothing is wasted. Even wax that fell during the funeral order may become part of another candle someday. You reduce the fire and step outside. The air is cold, and the sudden change in temperature makes your body ache. You walk toward your room, but before you arrive, you hear church bells ringing in the distance. You stop and listen. A funeral has begun. The sound travels through the dark streets, slow and heavy. You imagine the procession, people walking quietly, a coffin being carried through the streets, small candles glowing in their... The new church festival order should have been a welcome change after the funeral candles, but instead it becomes one of the most exhausting jobs you have ever taken. The church wants the candles to be tall, bright, and uniform, and the order is larger than expected because several nearby churches have decided to purchase candles from the same workshop. The master Chandler accepts the work because the payment will be valuable, but everyone in the workshop understands what that payment will cost in labor. Before sunrise, you are already beside the fire, preparing the first batch of wax while the apprentices carry blocks from storage. The workshop feels crowded now. Wax occupies almost every corner. Wooden racks are covered with unfinished candles, and the narrow passage between the workbench and the fire has become difficult to navigate. You have to move carefully because knocking over a rack could destroy an entire day's work. The first task is filtering the wax. The church has requested clean candles, and the master refuses to risk using wax containing too many impurities. You melt the blocks slowly, then pour the liquid through cloth to remove dirt and fragments. The process is slow because the wax must remain hot enough to flow, but not so hot that it becomes damaged. You watch the surface constantly, adjusting the fire whenever necessary. The apprentices prepare the wicks beside you, twisting the fibers and measuring them against a wooden guide. Everything has to be consistent. The candles will be used together during the festival, so obvious differences in size would look careless. Once the wax is ready, you begin dipping. The first layer is thin. The second adds a little more thickness. The third begins to give the candle its shape. You repeat the process again and again. Your hands move without thinking, but your mind begins drifting toward the festival itself. In a few days, the church will be filled with people. Bells will ring. Priests will move through the building. Music and chanting will fill the stone interior. The candles you are making will be placed around the altar and carried through the church during the ceremony. The light will reflect against painted walls, statues, metal objects, and polished stone. From the outside, the scene will look magnificent. Nobody will see the workshop. Nobody will see the hours spent beside the fire. You continue working while imagining the finished ceremony. By midday, the workshop is unbearably hot. The fire has been burning continuously, and the large quantity of wax requires constant heating. You open every shutter, but the air outside is also warm. Sweat runs down your face and neck. Wax sticks to your fingers. Your shirt becomes damp and uncomfortable. You wipe your forehead and immediately leave a streak of wax across your skin. One apprentice laughs quietly when he sees it, and for a moment everyone smiles. It is a small moment of relief in an otherwise exhausting day. Then the master reminds everyone that the deadline is approaching, and the laughter disappears. You return to work. The candles continue growing. One of the larger candles begins to lean slightly. You notice it before anyone else does and immediately remove it from the rack. If it cools in that position, it will be difficult to straighten. You hold it carefully near the warmth of the fire and slowly reshape it. The wax softens under the heat. You straighten the candle and allow it to cool again. The correction takes only a few minutes, but you know that if you had not noticed the problem, the entire candle might have been ruined. This is the kind of attention required in your trade. You cannot simply make the candle and walk away. You must watch it throughout the process. Temperature, thickness, shape, wick position, surface quality, and cooling all matter. Your eyes are constantly moving. Your hands are constantly working. Your mind is constantly checking. The work may appear simple from outside, but it demands concentration for hours at a time. During the afternoon, a church official arrives to inspect the order. He walks through the workshop carefully, avoiding the wax scraps on the floor. He looks at the finished candles and asks whether they will all burn for the same length of time. The master explains that the candles are designed to be as uniform as possible. The official picks up several candles and compares them. He is satisfied, but then he asks whether the workshop can produce additional candles before the festival. The master hesitates. You can see the calculation in his face. More candles mean more payment, but they also mean more work. Finally, he agrees. The official leaves, and everyone in the workshop becomes silent. You know what the agreement means. The workday has just become longer. The additional order is started immediately. More wax is brought from storage. More wicks are prepared. More rods are arranged. You begin dipping again. The repetition becomes almost unbearable. Hours pass. Your shoulders burn. Your fingers ache. The same movement continues until it feels like part of your breathing. Down. Cool. Down. Cool. The candle grows. Then another. Then another. You stop counting because the numbers no longer matter. There are simply more candles waiting. As the sun begins to set, the church bells ring across the town. You hear them clearly through the open shutters. The sound reminds you that the festival is approaching. You imagine people preparing their best clothing, merchants preparing food, families making plans, and church officials organizing the ceremony. Everyone is preparing for a moment of celebration while you are preparing the light that will fill it. The contrast is strange. You are working through the evening so that other people can enjoy an evening of light. Outside, the streets begin to darken. Inside, your workshop becomes brighter because several candles have already been lit to help you see. You are surrounded by the very product you are producing. It feels almost like being trapped inside a small artificial sunrise. The fire glows. The candles glow. The walls glow. Yet your body feels increasingly exhausted. One apprentice accidentally drops a finished candle. It strikes the floor and breaks near the base. Everyone looks at it. The apprentice freezes. The master closes his eyes for a moment, then tells him to collect the pieces. The wax can be reheated and used again, but the labor has been lost. You can see the frustration on the apprentice's face. He knows that he has wasted hours of work. You tell him that mistakes happen, but the master reminds him that the workshop cannot afford many mistakes. The broken candle is placed into the recycling container. You watch it disappear among the other scraps. Tomorrow it may become another candle. Nothing truly ends in the workshop. Wax is constantly being transformed. A damaged candle becomes raw material. A failed batch becomes another batch. Scraps become new layers. The material survives even when the labor does not. Late at night, the workshop finally becomes quiet. The master counts the finished candles and realizes that there are still more to produce. Nobody complains. Everyone knows that the order must be completed. You continue until your eyes begin to feel heavy. The apprentice beside you yawns repeatedly, but his hands keep moving. The workshop has become a place where people learn to work while exhausted. You remember when you first entered the trade and believed that the hardest part would be learning the technique. Now you know that the hardest part is simply continuing. Technique can be learned. Endurance has to be built through years of repetition. Eventually, the final candles of the night are placed on the racks. You look at them and notice how perfectly they reflect the firelight. The smooth wax looks almost golden. For a brief moment, the workshop feels peaceful. You stand there quietly, looking at the result of the day's labor. Then you remember that there are still several days. The festival is now only a few days away, and the workshop has become almost impossible to recognize beneath the enormous quantity of candles waiting to be finished. Racks cover the walls, wooden tables are covered with wicks and tools, and every available corner contains blocks of wax. The master Chandler has stopped accepting smaller orders because there is simply no room to produce anything else until the church festival order is completed. You arrive before sunrise as usual, but this morning the workshop feels different. Everyone knows that the final deadline is approaching, and the pressure has changed the way people work. Nobody speaks unless necessary. The apprentices move quickly between the storage area and the workbench, carrying wax and preparing wicks. You stand beside the melting pot and watch the surface of the wax begin to move as the heat slowly transforms it into liquid. You add another piece of wood to the fire and wait. The flames rise, reflecting against the metal container. You check the temperature carefully because the wax cannot be allowed to become too hot. Too much heat can darken the wax, damage its quality, or make the dipping process difficult. Too little heat and the wax becomes thick, creating uneven layers. The entire process depends on finding the narrow space between these two problems. You have become good at judging it without measuring anything. You can tell by the way the wax moves. You can tell by the smell. You can tell by the way the surface reflects the firelight. Years of repetition have turned your senses into tools. While the wax melts, you begin preparing the largest candles. These will be placed around the church during the festival, and the church officials want them to be impressive. They are almost as tall as a person when finished, and each requires a great amount of wax. You secure the thick wicks to long wooden rods and begin the first dip. The wick disappears into the warm wax and emerges covered with a thin layer. You hold it steady. The wax begins to cool. Another dip, another layer, another pause. The process is painfully slow, but there is no shortcut. A large candle cannot be created in a few minutes. It must grow gradually, layer after layer, until it reaches the required size. As the morning continues, your shoulders begin to hurt. You change your grip on the rod, but the weight remains. The larger the candle becomes, the heavier it feels. Eventually, you need both hands to control it. You rotate the candle after every dip, ensuring that the wax spreads evenly around the wick. A small mistake can cause the entire candle to become crooked. You have learned to notice the smallest changes. A slight difference in thickness can be felt through your fingers. A tiny bend becomes obvious when the candle is held upright. A small crack can grow if it is ignored. You constantly inspect your work while trying to maintain the rhythm. The apprentice beside you is working on smaller candles, and you hear him counting quietly. He is trying to keep track of how many he has completed. You tell him not to focus on the number too much. Numbers can make the work feel endless. Instead, you tell him to focus on the candle in front of him. One candle at a time. He nods and continues. You realize that this is how you have survived the trade yourself. If you think about all the candles you have made during your lifetime, the number is impossible to imagine. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. But if you think about only the candle in your hands, the task feels manageable. One dip, one layer, One candle, then another. By midday, the workshop is extremely hot. The festival order has required the fire to remain active for hours, and the large amount of wax being processed makes the air heavy. Sweat runs down your back, but your hands remain close to the heat. The contradiction becomes almost absurd. Your body wants to escape the fire, but your work requires you to move closer to it. You wipe your face with a cloth, leaving a faint streak of wax across your cheek. One of the apprentices notices and smiles, but you do not have the energy to laugh. You continue working. Outside, the town is becoming increasingly busy as people prepare for the festival. Merchants are selling food, cloth, decorations, and other goods. The church bells ring more frequently. People are talking about the upcoming celebration. You can hear the excitement through the shutters. Inside the workshop, the mood is completely different. Your world is still fire and wax. You are creating the light that will make the celebration possible, but you are missing the celebration itself. The thought makes you pause for a moment. You have spent so many days working that you cannot remember the last time you attended a festival simply as a person. You have always been on the other side of it, preparing the things other people use. The master notices you staring toward the street and tells you to keep working. You return to the candles. In the afternoon, a church official arrives again, this time accompanied by 2 assistants. They inspect the largest candles and measure them carefully. One is considered slightly too thin. The official asks whether it can be made larger. The master says yes. You immediately understand who will have to do it. You take the candle and return it to the wax. The extra layers are added slowly. The official watches without understanding how long each additional layer takes. He simply wants the final result. You keep working. Another dip, another pause, another layer. Eventually, the candle reaches the required thickness. The official nods and moves on. You place the candle with the others. The master thanks you briefly, but there is no time to feel proud. More candles are waiting. The afternoon turns into evening. The sunlight disappears, and the workshop becomes dependent on its own candles for illumination. Several small candles are placed around the work area. Their flames move gently as the air circulates. The irony is impossible to miss. You are making candles to light a festival while using candles to make them. The workshop becomes filled with golden points of light. For a few minutes, the atmosphere is almost beautiful. Then you notice how much smoke is collecting near the ceiling. You open the shutters again. Cold air enters, and the smoke begins escaping. You cough and return to work. One of the apprentices asks whether the church will burn all the candles in one night. You tell him probably not, but many will be used during the ceremony. He asks what happens to the candles afterward. You explain that some will continue burning until they are gone, while others may be extinguished and used again later. He seems surprised that people would save a partially burned candle. You tell him that wax is valuable, and not everyone can afford to waste it. In wealthy households, candles may be left burning because their cost is insignificant compared with the comfort they provide. In poor households, every minute of flame matters. A candle may be extinguished whenever someone leaves the room and relit later. A family may gather around a single flame rather than lighting several. The apprentice listens carefully. He is beginning to understand that the candle trade is not only about making objects. It is also about understanding who can afford light. Night falls completely, but the workshop continues. The festival is now less than 2 days away. Everyone works late. Your body is exhausted, but the deadline creates its own kind of energy. You no longer think about sleep. You think only about finishing. The final batch of medium-sized candles is started near midnight. Your fingers are beginning to ache so badly that holding the rods becomes difficult. You wrap a strip of cloth around the handle to make it easier to grip. The cloth quickly becomes covered in wax. You continue. The master occasionally walks over to inspect the candles, but he says very little. He knows that everyone is exhausted. The festival ends, but the work does not. And the morning after the celebration, you return to the workshop feeling as though you have barely slept. Your body is still carrying the exhaustion of the previous days. Your shoulders are stiff. Your fingers ache whenever you close your hands, and the smell of smoke seems permanently trapped in your clothing. Yet the workshop is already waiting for you. The candles that illuminated the church last night are still burning in some places, but the people who admired them have already moved on to the next part of their lives. For you, there is no celebration after the celebration. There is only another order. The master has received a request from several local households, a small inn, and 2 merchants who need candles for the coming weeks. So before the fire has even reached its full heat, you are already preparing the wax again. The first thing you notice is how different the workshop feels without the enormous festival order filling every corner. The racks are mostly empty, the floor has been cleared, and the storage area finally has enough space to walk through without turning sideways. For a brief moment, you feel relieved. Then the master brings out the new list of orders and the relief disappears. There are dozens of small candles, several medium-sized candles, and a few larger ones requested by the merchants. None of the individual orders seems difficult, but together they represent another long stretch of repetitive work. You begin sorting the wax while the apprentices prepare the wicks. The fire is smaller than it was during the festival, but the workshop still becomes warm quickly. You have learned to recognize the different stages of the day by the temperature of the room. Early morning begins cold, midday becomes unbearable, and evening returns to cold again once the fire is reduced. Your body has become accustomed to this strange cycle. You work beside the fire until sweat forms on your forehead, then step away for a moment and feel the cold air against your skin. You return to the heat and repeat the process. The work is physically exhausting, but after years in the trade, you no longer question whether you can do it. You simply do it. The first batch of candles is for an innkeeper who wants to keep his dining room and sleeping areas illuminated after sunset. His order is larger than usual because travelers have been arriving more frequently, and he knows that guests expect some form of light after dark. When the innkeeper arrives to inspect the candles, he complains about the price. The master explains that the cost of beeswax has increased because of transportation difficulties, but the innkeeper argues that he has been a regular customer. You listen quietly as they negotiate. Eventually they agree on a price, but the innkeeper leaves looking dissatisfied. You understand why. Every customer wants cheaper candles, while every chandler wants to protect his profit. Between them stands the worker, whose hours are often the least visible part of the calculation. The innkeeper does not think about how long it takes to create each candle. He thinks about how many candles he can buy for his money and how long they will last. You return to the workbench and begin dipping. The first candle is small and easy to handle. You lower the wick into the wax, lift it, rotate it, and allow it to cool. Another dip, another layer. The candle grows slowly. You move to the next wick and repeat the process. After an hour, dozens of candles are hanging from the rods. After several hours, hundreds. Your hands move continuously. The apprentice beside you starts humming quietly, and the sound becomes part of the workshop. The fire crackles, wax drips, wood creaks. Outside, carts pass through the street. The bells ring occasionally in the distance. The entire medieval town seems to move around you while your own work remains trapped in the same repetitive rhythm. During the afternoon, a merchant arrives with a more unusual request. He wants candles that will burn for a particularly long time because he plans to travel with a group of traders through an area where there are few places to buy supplies. He asks whether you can make candles that are thick enough to last through several nights. The master explains that larger candles can burn for longer, but their size also makes them heavier and more expensive. The merchant agrees to pay the additional cost. You begin preparing a special batch. These candles must be carefully constructed because the merchant will carry them on a long journey. A badly made candle could crack during transportation, and there will be no workshop nearby to replace it. You use the cleanest wax and the strongest wicks. The candles grow slowly under your hands. You make sure each one is straight and compact. When you finish the first, you hold it upright and inspect it from every angle. It is one of the best candles you have made in weeks. The master approves it and tells you to use it as the model for the rest. You continue. This time the work feels slightly different because the candles will leave the town. You imagine them traveling along roads, perhaps carried by a merchant's wagon into another region. One of them may burn inside a tent. Another may illuminate a roadside inn. Another may be used by a traveler trying to read a letter after sunset. Your work will travel farther than you ever will. The thought is strangely comforting. You have spent most of your life inside the same town, but your candles can cross distances you may never see. As evening approaches, the innkeeper returns to collect his order. He examines the candles carefully, then takes several to test their weight. He lights one outside the workshop and watches the flame. The candle burns steadily. He seems satisfied. He pays the master and leaves with the order. You watch him disappear into the street. Another customer has taken a part of your work into the world. The workshop becomes quiet again for a short time. You sit down and stretch your fingers. The skin around your fingertips has become rough and cracked. You look at the small scars left by burns and think about how many more will probably appear before your working life ends. You wonder whether your hands will ever recover. Perhaps not. The trade leaves its marks permanently. Every Chandler you know has some sign of the work. Burned scars, hardened skin, wax stains, smoke-darkened clothing. Even the way they stand changes after years beside the workbench. Shoulders slightly bent, feet constantly shifting, hands moving automatically. You have begun to notice that you recognize other craftsmen by their posture before you recognize them by their faces. The blacksmith has heavy arms and burned forearms. The carpenter carries wood dust in his clothes. The mason's hands are rough with stone. The chandler smells of smoke and wax. Every occupation writes itself onto the body. The master calls you back to work before you can rest too long. There is another batch to finish. You return to the fire. The next order comes from a household preparing for a wedding. They want candles for the ceremony and the celebration afterward. The order is smaller than the festival order, but the customer wants the candles decorated slightly because the family is wealthy enough to care about appearance. The master decides that some of the candles will receive carefully shaped surfaces and additional finishing work. This means more time. You begin smoothing the wax and shaping the candles with heated tools. The work requires more precision than ordinary dipping. You carefully warm the surface without damaging the candle, then use a tool to create subtle patterns. The result is beautiful. You have to admit that. For once, the work feels less like endless production and more like craftsmanship. You are not simply creating another candle. You are making something intended to look special. The apprentice watches closely as you work. He asks how you learned to create the patterns. You tell him that nobody taught you with a book. You learned by watching another craftsman, copying his movements, making mistakes, and trying again. That is how most knowledge survives in the medieval workshop. One person shows another. The years have begun to change you in ways you never expected, and one morning, while standing beside the familiar fire, you suddenly realize that the workshop no longer feels like the place you entered as a young apprentice. The walls are darker from years of smoke. The wooden floor is covered with stains that cannot be removed, and the workbench has been worn smooth where thousands of candles have passed through your hands. Even the tools seem to have become part of the building. You know exactly where everything belongs, and you can reach for a wick, a knife, a rod, or a piece of cloth without looking. The workshop has become almost an extension of your body. Yet your body itself is beginning to betray you. Your back hurts more often now. Your knees ache after long hours standing. Your fingers do not recover as quickly from burns and small cuts. The younger apprentices move faster than you, and although you are still more experienced, you can feel the difference growing. The master Chandler notices it too, even if he does not say anything. One morning, he gives you a difficult order and asks you to supervise the apprentices while you work. It is a large order for a wealthy household that wants candles for an upcoming winter gathering, and the customer has specifically requested that the candles be made from the cleanest beeswax available. You immediately begin inspecting the stored wax, but this time you notice how difficult it has become to carry the heavier blocks. You lift one from the shelf and feel a sharp pain in your lower back. You set it down slowly and ask one of the apprentices to carry it instead. He does so without difficulty. You watch him walk toward the melting pot and realize that your role is slowly changing. You are no longer simply the strongest worker in the workshop. You are becoming the person who knows what to do. Experience is replacing physical strength. The realization is both comforting and frightening. You begin teaching the apprentices more carefully. You show them how to judge the temperature of the wax without constantly touching the container. You explain how to recognize poor wax by its smell and appearance. You demonstrate how to keep a candle straight during the dipping process and how to repair small cracks before they become larger problems. You teach them which mistakes can be corrected and which require starting again. You tell them never to leave the fire unattended. You tell them that a workshop full of wax and wood can become an inferno in moments. You tell them to keep the floor clear and the tools organized. The apprentices listen, sometimes impatiently, because they are young and believe they already understand the work. You recognize that impatience because you once had it yourself. You remember thinking that the old craftsmen were too slow, too cautious, and too concerned with small details. Now you understand that those details are the difference between a candle that burns properly and one that fails. The first batch is prepared, and you allow the youngest apprentice to perform the dipping while you watch. He moves too quickly. The wax forms an uneven layer. You stop him and explain why. He tries again. This time the result is better. You tell him to continue. There is a strange satisfaction in seeing someone learn the same craft that has consumed so much of your own life. Yet beneath that satisfaction is another thought. If he learns everything you know, what will happen to you? The workshop will no longer need you in the same way. You have always assumed that experience would make you more valuable, but eventually the younger workers will become experienced too. The trade has no guarantee that an old craftsman will always remain necessary. You continue supervising while the order progresses. The wealthy household has requested several dozen large candles and many smaller ones. The large candles take longer, but the apprentices handle most of the physical work now. You inspect their progress and correct mistakes. You begin spending more time near the workbench than beside the fire. The change seems small, but it feels significant. For years, the fire was the center of your life. Now you stand farther away from it. You can still feel its heat, but you no longer need to stand directly beside it for every hour of the day. This gives your body some relief, but it also makes you feel strangely distant from the work. You watch the apprentices dip the candles and realize that they are beginning to move with the same rhythm you developed years ago. Down, cool, down, cool. Their hands are learning the language of wax. By afternoon, the order is nearly finished. One of the apprentices makes a mistake with a large candle and creates an uneven section near the middle. He immediately looks at you, expecting anger. Instead, you show him how to repair it. You warm the damaged area gently and add a thin layer of wax. You explain that the goal is not to avoid every mistake, but to learn which mistakes can be saved. He watches carefully. When the repair is finished, the candle looks almost perfect. The apprentice smiles. You feel proud of him. You also feel something else that is harder to explain. You are beginning to see the future of the workshop without yourself at its center. The thought makes you uncomfortable. That evening, after the order is completed, the master asks you to stay behind. He tells you that he has been thinking about your future. He knows that your body is becoming weaker, and he suggests that you spend more time teaching the apprentices rather than performing the heaviest work. He says that eventually you may become responsible for training new workers and inspecting finished candles. It would mean fewer hours beside the fire and more responsibility inside the workshop. You agree, but you do not know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. For years you believed that success meant becoming strong enough to endure the work. Now success seems to mean knowing when to step away from it. The next morning, you begin your new responsibilities. The apprentices arrive before sunrise and start preparing the workshop. You inspect the fire, check the wax, and review the day's orders. One apprentice asks whether a certain batch of wax can be used for ceremonial candles. You examine it carefully and tell him that it is acceptable for ordinary candles but not clean enough for the most important orders. He asks why. You explain that ceremonial candles are often inspected more closely and that the color and consistency matter. He nods and separates the wax. You realize that you have begun speaking like the old craftsman who once taught you. The same phrases, the same warnings, the same patience. It feels strange to hear your own voice giving advice that you once considered boring. As the day continues, you spend less time dipping candles yourself and more time moving between the apprentices. You correct their technique. You check the thickness of finished candles. You inspect the wicks. You watch the fire. Your body is less exhausted by evening, but your mind feels strangely tired from constant attention. Teaching is not easy. When you work alone, a mistake affects only your own candle. When you supervise others, every mistake becomes your responsibility. If an apprentice burns himself, you feel responsible. If a candle cracks, you must explain why. If the fire becomes dangerous, you must act immediately. You have traded physical exhaustion for mental responsibility. One afternoon, the workshop receives a large order from a church that has heard about the quality of your candles. The master is pleased. Reputation has finally begun bringing larger customers. He tells you that the workshop's name is becoming known in nearby districts. You feel a small sense of pride. The work has not been easy, but years of careful craftsmanship have created something that people recognize. Yet the irony remains. The reputation belongs to the workshop, not necessarily to you. Customers rarely ask who made the candles. They simply know that candles from this shop burn well. Your individual contribution remains invisible. Still, you understand that craftsmen rarely receive fame. Their work survives through objects rather than names. A candle does not carry your signature. It simply burns. The years continue to pass, and although the workshop remains almost exactly the same, you are no longer the same person who once entered it as a young apprentice with unburned hands and the belief that hard work alone could shape the future. Your hair has begun to turn gray, your movements are slower, and the scars on your fingers have become part of your hands rather than something you notice individually. The apprentices who once looked up to you are now skilled craftsmen themselves, and some of them have begun teaching younger workers using the same methods you taught them. One morning, you stand near the doorway and watch the youngest apprentice struggle with his first large candle. And for a moment you see yourself many years earlier, standing in exactly the same place, making exactly the same mistakes. He dips the wick too quickly, pulls it out unevenly, and the wax forms a thick section on one side. He looks at you nervously, waiting for criticism. Instead, you walk over and show him how to rotate the rod slowly. You tell him to let the wax cool naturally rather than forcing the process. You explain that a candle cannot be rushed into perfection. He listens carefully and tries again. This time the layer is smoother. You nod and he smiles. The moment is small, but it makes you realize that the trade has continued through you. The knowledge you once received from another craftsman has passed through your hands and entered someone else's. Your own name may disappear, but the skill remains. The workshop begins another ordinary day. There are orders from a church, a merchant, several households, and a monastery. Nothing about the work suggests that your story is nearing its end. The town still needs candles, and darkness still arrives every evening. You inspect the wax, check the fire, and walk between the workstations while the younger craftsmen perform most of the physical labor. You no longer stand beside the melting pot for the entire day, but you still spend enough time near it to feel the familiar heat on your face. The smell of beeswax immediately brings back memories of your youth. You remember your first day in the workshop, the first burn, the first large order, the first time you were trusted to work without supervision. You remember the nights when you believed that the trade would never become easier. In some ways, it never did. Your body simply became accustomed to the hardship. Now you watch the younger workers complain about aching shoulders and tired hands, and you almost want to laugh because you know they will eventually stop noticing the pain. But you also know what the work will cost them. You see the future written in their hands. Their skin will become rough. Their fingers will collect small scars. Their clothes will smell of smoke. Their backs will ache after long days. The trade will become part of their bodies just as it became part of yours. You cannot tell them to leave because you know that for many of them the workshop is their opportunity to earn a living. Medieval life offers few easy choices. A young person may inherit a family trade, become an apprentice, work for a master, join a guild, serve a household, work on a farm, or perform one of countless difficult occupations. None guarantee comfort. You entered the world of wax because it was the opportunity available to you, and over time it became your identity. Now you realize that the same thing is happening to the apprentices. One of them may eventually own a workshop. Another may travel to another town and establish his own business. Another may leave the trade completely. You cannot know. But for now, they are here standing beside the same fire. One afternoon, An old customer arrives at the workshop. He recognizes you immediately and says that he remembers buying candles from you many years ago. You are surprised that he remembers. He tells you that his family has always preferred candles from this workshop because they burn longer and more cleanly than those sold by other Chandlers. His words make you feel unexpectedly proud. You ask how his family is doing, and he tells you about his children and grandchildren. As he speaks, you realize that some of the candles you made years ago may have burned in the same household. They were used during meals, prayers, illnesses, celebrations, and quiet evenings. He never knew who made them, but he remembers the light. You wonder how many other families could say the same. How many homes have been illuminated by your hands without anyone knowing your name? The thought stays with you long after the customer leaves. Later that evening, the workshop receives an order for a particularly large ceremonial candle. The church wants it to be used during an important religious occasion, and they specifically ask for a candle of exceptional size and quality. The younger craftsmen begin preparing it, but the master asks you to supervise the process. You inspect the wax and select the cleanest pieces. You examine the wick and make sure it is strong enough. Then you stand beside the workers as they begin building the candle. Layer by layer, it grows. The process reminds you of the enormous candles you made years ago when you were still strong enough to carry them easily. Now you watch someone else hold the heavy rod. You remember how your arms used to ache after hours of work. You remember the satisfaction of finishing a large candle and seeing it stand perfectly straight on the rack. You realize that your physical relationship with the trade is almost over. Soon you may no longer be able to perform the hardest tasks at all. But you are not as afraid of that as you expected. You have already given the trade what you could. Your hands may slow down, but your knowledge remains. As the candle grows, you correct small imperfections and explain each adjustment to the apprentice. You show him how to recognize a weak section and how to strengthen it without ruining the shape. You tell him that the best craftsmen are not those who never make mistakes, but those who notice them early enough to repair them. He remembers the advice. The candle is finally finished late in the afternoon. It stands taller than most people and glows softly in the evening light. You place your hand against its surface for a moment. It is smooth, cool, and solid. You know that the church will eventually light it, and the flame will slowly consume everything you have helped create. Yet you no longer find that depressing. You understand now that the purpose of the candle was never to last forever. Its purpose was to burn. The same is true of the work itself. A candle is valuable because it gives light while it exists. Your craft has been similar. Your working life has been long, difficult, and often miserable, but it has given something to the people around you. It gave light to homes that would otherwise have been dark. It illuminated church services, funerals, festivals, merchant shops, and private rooms. It helped travelers see roads at night. It allowed people to read, pray, eat, work, mourn, celebrate, and simply remain awake after sunset. You may never appear in a history book, but your work has existed inside the lives of countless people. That realization changes the way you think about your years in the workshop. You still remember the burns. You still remember the aching back and the long nights. You still remember customers complaining about prices and rejecting candles that took hours to make. You remember the fear of workshop fires and the uncertainty of wax shortages. You remember days when you wanted to leave the trade completely. The life was miserable in many ways, but it was also necessary. Without people like you, the medieval town would become much darker every evening. The final ceremonial candle is delivered to the church, and you decide to walk there with the workers. The streets are busy, but you barely notice the noise. You are thinking about the journey your work has taken. You pass the market where you once sold candles as a young apprentice. You pass the houses of customers who have since died. You pass the inn where merchants once bought your candles before long journeys. You pass the church where you watched funeral processions carrying flames made from your wax. Everywhere you look, memories are attached to small pieces of light. When you arrive at the church, the large candle is carried